Welcome to the show, everyone. This is the first episode of our 5th season. So happy to have made it this far and to have all your fantastic support all the way through. We're really going from strength to strength with each season. And to kick off season 5, we have workplace health promotion royalty on the show. If you're interested in workplace well-being and health promotion, and well, I'm guessing you are if you're listening to the Work Well podcast, then my guest today will seriously inspire you. Stavroula Leka is a professor of work organization and well-being at Cork University Business School, and she's also an emeritus professor of work and health policy at the School of Medicine, University of Nottingham. Stavroula has a phenomenal body of work under her belt. She really does, and we touch on a lot of that in our conversation. She's emerged as a real thought leader in the area of psychological health and safety in the workplace. And regular listeners to the show will know that I've been championing ISO45003, so the first global standard for psychological health and safety at work. I've been championing that since it was published in 2021. And guess what? Stavroula chaired the ISO working group that developed ISO 45003, and she co-wrote it. So if you're not impressed by that, then you're probably listening to the wrong podcast. So sit back and be inspired by my conversation with Stavroula Leka. So Stavroula, hello and welcome to the Work Well podcast.
Hello, Brian. Thank you for having me.
No, it's a real pleasure. Tell us, how are you and how is life and work for you at the moment?
Well, I'm well. I think like a lot of us, I'm working in a hybrid fashion. So today I work from home and I also go to the office on whenever I have meetings and teaching, probably about 2 days per week. So this is how it's working out at the moment.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I introduced you, I read out the bio as part of the introduction, that you've had a really impressive career to date. Could you share with us how did you initially get into this area of work, and maybe tell us a few career highlights?
Sure. So when I finished my undergraduate in psychology, that was back in Greece. I come from Greece originally. Mm-hmm. I was looking at different, master specialization. I was always interested in organizational psychology, but at that point in time, that was back in 1995-6. So at that point in time, already we have started to see a lot of evidence coming out in relation to issues such as work-related stress in the workplace. So I was interested in sort of maybe mental health at work. And there were not so many postgraduate programs at that time when I was looking around, and more specifically, I was looking at the UK. So I ended up in the University of Nottingham, where they had the first master's in occupational health psychology, and it combined the two areas essentially. And so I thought, fantastic. And that's how it happened. I ended up in the UK. I loved it. Then part of that course, there was a focus on legislation and policy, because I do a lot of that. And so I wanted to focus more on the psychosocial work environment, got a scholarship and for a PhD and stayed. And that's how I got into this area. I was lucky also in that at the University of Nottingham, they had a World Health Organization collaborating center for occupational health. And this is when the whole area was emerging of the psychosocial work environment. And I became very much involved in that, and later on took it over as director. So I would say that was one of the first highlights. And through that work, I did attend a lot of high-level meetings with the WHO, the ILO, the European Commission, and got involved in different projects that were collaborative. And I love that. I love working with people internationally. And so, yes, I think other highlights include the work for those organizations, contributions to ministerial conferences, to high-level meetings at the EU, and developing, of course, different types of tools and guidelines at different levels.
Fantastic. Yes. So your undergrad brought you then to the University in Nottingham. You've actually stayed there for 7 years, if I'm not mistaken. You got involved with developing the program there.
I was in Nottingham actually for 23 years.
Oh, okay.
Well, if I count my time as well, from 96 until 2018, I was,
yeah.
and then I was also, I had a part-time appointment for a couple of years, and then I was made emeritus professor. So I'm still there in a way, but not so
Sure.
much. 2018, I moved to Ireland because I thought maybe it's time for a change and something exciting. So that's how I ended up here, but I'm still maintaining that link.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. And I think for a while as well in Ireland, there was a lot of students that were interested in this area would have actually gone to or taken the programs in the university in Nottingham because there was nothing available in Ireland at the time.
Yeah, you're right. I did have a few students from Ireland, and in fact, I can mention even one of them now is my PhD student. She's working
fantastic.
in the HSC. She's a lead for Wellbeing for Ireland. So that's quite fantastic that I came back and we managed to connect again, and now she's doing a PhD.
Fantastic. Yeah. And you're based in UCC now?
I'm based in UCC, yes. I'm based in the business school. In the University of Nottingham, my appointment is through the School of Medicine and Public Health. So because my expertise, you see, is multidisciplinary, so I bring different types of expertise together, so it fits quite well. And I think this area now is a priority, both in public health and of course for business.
Excellent. Yeah. And so you mentioned you like the kind of collaboration and international collaboration in particular. And certainly a great example of this would be, I guess, your work in ISO45003, published in June of last year, as many of the listeners will know. It's the first global standard for psychological health in the workplace. You actually co-chaired the working group that developed that standard. Can you tell us what was the process like for going through that? Okay.
So I got involved in standardization work back in 2009, I would say. And that was when the British Standards Institution approached us because we're doing a lot of work at that point through the PRIMA-EF project. It was a pan-European project that was developing a best practice framework for the management of psychosocial risks across Europe that was also adapted by WHO. So they knew about this work and the guidelines that we had brought out. And so they approached us to develop the first national standard in the UK. And actually that came about in 2011. And that's why I got to know the world of standards, and I co-wrote that national standard. It was a guidance standard. Now, at the same time in Canada, they started working on their national standard on psychological health and safety at work.
Sure.
So we collaborated with those colleagues as well. And we were, always thinking we need a global standard.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, at that point, we didn't even have an ISO in health and safety. So we approached them and they said, look, guys, you have to wait because 45001 is in the making. We knew that. So wait for that to be published. And then we developed a proposal already. And as soon as 45001 was published, we put it to ISO that we want to bring about another guidance standard that will be global.
So this is you and the people you've worked with.
And the Canadian colleagues.
UK, Canadian bodies. Yeah,
Yes.
Mary Ann Bainton has been on the show before. I know she was involved in the Canadian standard. Yeah.
That's right. So because you need to have chairs of a technical committee, as it's called. So we decided we will co-chair it, the people who had experience in developing national standards. So it was myself from the UK and Norma, I can't remember her last name now, but from Canada. But we're not alone, right? Sure. Because you have a technical committee that involves many different countries. So that proposal was put to ISO and it was approved by a huge majority. We were very surprised also. That was positive because countries where we didn't expect to have a positive response were also this time around very well received. So like the US, for example, countries like India or even countries like Pakistan, African countries, that is great because it really showed that there was a need globally for such a standard. And I must say that the colleagues that were involved in the committee, because how it works is then you form a technical committee and you have both standardization experts because standards are written in a very technical way, do's and don'ts. And then we had, of course, subject experts from different countries. So I think we had around 80 people in the committee that developed the standards, quite a big committee. The work started in 2017, and it took about 3.5 years until the standard was published. It is quite challenging. You need to marry the different perspectives. In the meantime, in 2019, Australia also published a standard, a national standard. So, but there were a lot of perspectives, different levels of understanding. And at the end of the day, standards, the language that you use in standards, to some extent is about compromise across different stakeholders. But I believe that in the end, we achieve a very good result in bringing about a standard that's quite comprehensive. And I think most experts will agree that it's an excellent contribution that was lacking. Absolutely,
yeah. And we'll talk about the actual standard itself in a moment. But so 80 people involved. Would that be 80 different countries or jurisdictions represented as well?
Not necessarily 80 different countries. From some countries, you might have had, I think a maximum of about 2 experts or 3 experts sometimes. But yeah, it was at least 60 countries around the table.
And when you were going out looking for people to get involved and countries to get involved, was there a process for that? Were you just looking?
That is managed through the national standardization committees.
Okay.
Right. So because each country has a national committee, and so they propose the experts on standards, and they involve particular subject experts from their country as well. So it's not us who are responsible for the country. These chairs actually have to maintain some sort of distance and objectivity, because there are different perspectives, as I say, and we need to resolve maybe some disagreements as they arise, or ensure that the outcome is agreeable by everybody. But it's the national committees that then suggest the experts that take part in the process.
Okay, very good. And so you were at the time, I guess you were representing the UK.
Initially, yes. I was representing the UK, and because this is where it all started.
Sure.
Later on, I moved to Ireland, but because I still maintained the connection with the UK, still had that link there through the UK. Now, the National Committee, the Irish Standards National Body, was represented also in this committee. But we had experts in standardization. I do not think we had any subject matter expert from Ireland in the committee. Of course, I was there, but you can say that I was wearing different hats at that point in time. But we did not have, through the national committee, a subject matter expert. And we did ask, of course, everybody to suggest people. But at the end, I think we ended up with 2 experts in standardization only.
Very good, very good. And talk us through the actual process then. It was a series of meetings, workshops to try and work through all the points.
That's right. So we would meet twice per year. Okay. And of course the pandemic happened. We had in the beginning 3 meetings. There was one in Coventry in the UK, the second one in Dallas in the US, and the third one was in Rwanda in Africa, which was quite interesting. Yeah. So basically, it's where countries within the committee are happy to host the meetings. And then COVID happened, and all the plans, we were planning to have at least 2 more meetings. They did not take place. But at the same time, you have online meetings, of course. And the process is that first you agree on the outline of the standard and the different sections. And of course, this standard 45003, the aim is that it supports 45001. Yeah. And I know that you will ask me about this, but essentially 45001 is the standard that's auditable, right? Yeah. So companies can audit their practices against 45001. 45003 is a guidance standard that supplements the implementation and supports the implementation of 45001. So companies cannot audit in the strictest of sense the practice against 45003, but in reality, and I do receive a lot of emails every week.
Me too, actually.
That's right. They approach me and they say, well, can you help us see where we are? In line with 45003? And I think that's the right way to go. You need to start thinking about how your practices align with 45003, and down the line through the process of accreditation, certification of 45001, also focus on this in this aspect more, as you should anyway. But you know that many businesses do not initially, or many organizations do not initially do so.
Sure. And to be clear then, so 45001, it's the parent standard. It's a large standard. It's for the overall occupational health and safety in the workplace. Isn't that right?
That's right. That's right. And you know, when we put the proposal that I told you to ISO, there was a country, France in particular, that did not like the idea of having guidance standards in relation to particular risk factors like psychosocial risk that support 45001. They thought 45001 is fine, but we know, of course, from evidence that this is where businesses need a lot of support, which is why this idea was supported widely. In fact, the only oppositions that we had to the standard was the one I mentioned from France, because they thought this is not a good idea to have guidance standards linked to 45001. And then it was Germany and Austria who thought it's better to have legislation on psychosocial risks rather than standards. So they wanted an even stronger approach. And in fact, since COVID-19, we see a lot of movement by European trade unions pushing for more law in this area. Yeah. And
so 45003, it's a guidance standard.
It's a guidance standard.
Is it possible then, will it ever change that it will be possible to be, you know, an audit will be possible against it, do you think?
I don't think so, because I think the thinking at ISO is that it should support the implementation of 45001, but 45001 has clear reference to both psychosocial risk and mental health. It does in different sections. So essentially, whoever is auditing organizational practice against 45001 should be put in focus also in these areas. And now they know how to do it. They know what to look for through the guidance that is provided by 45003. I should also say that apart from the committee that sort of develops the drafts of the standard, and there are many reiterations, many drafts, there is also a public consultation in the process. So the standard is published, it stays out there for a good amount of time, maybe 3 months, and anybody can provide comments that then the committee considers and maybe adjusts the text a bit, or agrees that maybe this change is not necessary. So we went through that. There were many comments that we received. That is great. It shows that different people are engaged in the process. And the end result is something, again, that was considered all these different perspectives.
Excellent. Yeah. Because I'm kind of thinking out loud here about, let's say, some of the companies that have contacted me about 45003, and we're thinking, oh, look, we'd like to maybe get audited against it. I'm just wondering, for 45001, it would be a significant effort, I imagine, for an organization to implement that fully. So we're probably talking about larger sized organizations. Would you agree on that? That would go for 45001? And then I'm kind of, again, thinking out loud, how would it, like the smaller organizations, is it just a case of maybe aligning themselves with 45003? Is that the best approach?
Well, in fact, that was a wider debate since the 45001 was published. And if you go on the ISO website, you will see that now there is specific guidance on the implementation of 45001 in smaller companies.
Okay.
Yes. So
I'll get the detail for that. Yeah, I'll share that.
So that is good, because there is more specific guidance for smaller organizations. It's been recognized, of course, that you need a different approach. Now, initially, what we wanted to do, for those of the audience that might be familiar with this, the Canadian standard in particular, that is the first national auditable standard on psychological health and safety in the workplace. had some very useful annexes, and the annexes provided specific guidance on how to implement that national standard in large and smaller organizations. So our idea for ISO was to do something similar and have some annex that can support. But unfortunately, there was not agreement in the committee that this is necessary, because a lot of the standards experts, not necessarily the subject experts, thought that in a guidance standard, we should not have this kind of tools. And now my personal view was not this, it was that we should have something that can assist even the implementation on a more practical level, but unfortunately we could not go with that because of rules that as they align with standardization.
Okay, so there are options there. So I can get those links and I'll include them in the notes with this podcast. That's great. What do you think? It's June of last year. What's been the reaction to date? Are you getting much feedback from organizations that are aligning themselves with 45003?
Yes, I do. I think you're quite right in saying that it's mostly larger organizations, those who have been active to a certain extent in this area, and now they have more concrete guidance that they would like to sort of start comparing the practice, benchmarking their practices against. So I think we are at an early stage. Still, it's the stage where people familiarize themselves with the standard and they are looking into the practices. I think what we will see going forward is more focus on sort of certification, if you like, or more focus through the 45001 certification process. I think there is interest in many countries. And I think also that ISO and the national bodies, I know, for example, BSI is organizing several events in the UK, and now follow-up events. I'm involved in some of those. And at the local level, some of them are for public sector organizations or more private sector organizations. They want to exactly do that and benchmark their practices. That takes a bit of time, I think, for people, because what you will find out is maybe they don't tick all the boxes as they're specified in the standard. So I guess it will take some time for them to adjust the practices before they actually would include more specifically this area in accreditation or reaccreditation or certification on the basis of 45001. Very
good, yeah.
But we do want to do a study, I should say, yes, of course, I'm in the university, my interest to see whether this standard is actually usable, it's helpful, whether people think it's comprehensive or anything else, because, you know, standards are updated, of course, every few years. So we have the opportunity to include new areas if necessary. So we have talked to various stakeholders, and we will go down that route, and we will do a study of various organizations to see whether it's useful. I think it probably won't start this year, but from next year we'll start looking into organizing that.
Very good. Yeah. Well, I can certainly send some people and organizations your way for that study. I'm thinking of one in particular when I hosted a webinar on this last year, just to introduce it to the community. I had a guest on, Carrie Buds. She's based in an organization, a global organization, but maybe part time, I guess her role would be looking at something like ISO 45003, but just off her own initiative. She'd heard some of the podcasts that I had. She went through the standard, started literally with a spreadsheet, stepping through it, getting her team in a room, doing a couple of surveys. Is that for literally an organization getting started? I mean, is that a way to go about it? If you don't have, let's say, a dedicated health and well-being officer or team or department, is that a way to go about it? So
okay. So the standard, as you will see, as you know, is structured in different sections. Okay, and these sections provide specific guidance on what the organization should be doing. And the main areas would be getting your policies right. Okay, whether you have a broad policy on health and safety or occupational health or HR policies, depending on the level, ensuring that there are clear policies in relation to these issues. Then there will be, of course, guidance in relation to how you conduct the risk assessment. So what you said, maybe depending on the size of the organization, it could be survey-based or it could be more qualitative as well in nature if you have a smaller organization. And the standard provides very clear guidance on what are the kinds of issues that you should be addressing through your assessment of potential risks. And then, of course, on the basis of the findings, what kinds of interventions you can put in place. So I think these are the three main things, of course, also supplemented with addressing any awareness and competency development needs that the organization might have. And it might be, you know, even for your leaders, line managers, or your staff. I think that is the first step. These are the 4 broad areas that the organization should look at. And you're quite right. So since the standard is providing clear guidance across these areas, it's easy to go through them and at a broad level, look at how much are we doing here? Are we doing anything? First of all, how well are we doing? Are we covering these aspects? Are we in line with the broad principles of the standard? Because the standard is basically putting focus on prevention, first of all, not only reaction, and addressing the causes, the root causes of issues, right? So it is about working conditions, work organization, work design, and management issues. And it gives a long list of what does that mean exactly in the workplace in the context of this particular area.
Excellent, yeah. And I love I love that it gives that focus on prevention. Because I think from the organizations that I work with, like they're not bad actually at the secondary and the tertiary interventions, you know, the EAP programs, awareness training, mental health first aid, for example. But it's when the actual preventative methods, the primary interventions, I think a lot of organizations are weak on. So this really helps focus, doesn't it, on those organizational hazards.
Exactly. And I think this is where most companies will see, most organizations will see that they're lacking, maybe the practice are not where they need to be, because you're quite right. I think a lot of them in terms of maybe training, skills development, or dealing with individual issues through maybe employee assistance programs or in other ways, identifying symptoms, that's fine. But the standard has a clear focus on the working conditions level. So how do we develop healthy psychosocial work environments? This is the main focus there. And so to do that, you need to be able to identify potential risks to your workers' health, psychological and social risks. And you need to be able to do this kind of assessment to allow you to see whether these types of risks might be related to several types of outcomes, not only in terms of individual employee health and well-being, but also organizational, let's say, healthiness. That concept is there in the literature as well. So it could be anything apart from issues like sickness, absence, like presenteeism, like human error, you know, in high-risk organizations, that's a huge issue. It could be also just performance, you know, it could be good communication practices and other outcomes that are more business-focused outcomes. So I think there is enough literature now in this area to show that good management of these types of issues lead to a lot of good outcomes at the individual and organizational level.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So
and the other thing, sort of dirty, Brian, that we could do is, you know, I mentioned we wanted to have these annexes, let's say, that give a bit of focus on how to implement. But if somebody goes on the Canadian standard, for example, as I said, there are some interesting examples. There are various tools that actually organizations can use to risk assess for psychosocial risks. And there are also a lot of examples on good practices. What are some good practice interventions depending on the risk factors in these areas? So I would say the national standards will have some more detail in there that I would urge people to look at. And of course, there are other organizations out there that have provided such guidance over the years, like ILO, WHO, etc.
Sure. Yeah. Very good. So given your base in Ireland now, and of course your international work, is it possible, do you have a view on how Irish organizations are doing, let's say, compared to their international counterparts?
I wouldn't say that Irish organizations are doing badly, first of all, and I think
good.
Why? Okay. First of all, I should say that those organizations that in general have been found to do better are based in countries where there is a long tradition understanding around these issues. Also where there are relevant policies and even legislation. So I would say that in Europe, on the European Union, I should say, as a whole, you do see more awareness. There is legislation. Now with COVID-19, we see even the implementation of more specific legislation in these areas. So I think in Europe, there is understanding around what the psychological health and well-being mean. What do they mean, rather? But I think what we see, because there is data that we get, we have broad European surveys with employees and employers that run every about 5 years, for years now. And what we see is that the link is broken often. So people are aware of the issues. They might even are able to identify the issues, but they need support to implement the right types of interventions to address the issues. And I think there we see again and again a huge need for support. And that is in Ireland as well. This is the case. There are good tools that have been developed. For example, there was the adaptation many years ago by the Health and Safety Authority of the UK Management Standards for Work-Related Stress that again has a focus on the psychosocial work environment. So the work positive tool that is
excellent tool. Yeah.
This has a focus in this area. But I think, yes, organizations need more support to put in place appropriate interventions. And so what we are doing at the moment is that we are communicating, especially with the European Commission. We have that data. And I think what we are not doing well enough is forecasting. So we need to provide tools to organizations to be able to forecast, then to put in place those preventive measures that I referred to before. That is not so well developed, I would say.
I agree, yeah.
There is even the opportunity to use the European data that we have there to develop benchmarks to see, for example, in Ireland, what are the employees telling us in different sectors? How do they compare? If someone is using a particular questionnaire, can we give them an idea on where they are in comparison to other businesses? And that is possible to do even with the European data, but it hasn't been done. The reason it hasn't been done, even though we have been discussing it over many years with the European Commission, is that they don't, in a way, they don't want to bring out data that will show, okay, that in certain countries are much worse than others. Don't want to, let's say, to instigate a feeling across the union that, there is a divide. But the reality is that, unfortunately, there is a divide. And the data that exists already shows that.
Okay. I don't know, have you had a chance to look through the Healthy Ireland's Healthy Workplace Framework, the launch of that? I know there's some case studies in there. Yeah. It's early stage, but is this a step in the right direction?
It is a step in the right direction, of course. And in fact, the PhD student that I mentioned before, based in the HSE, because the HSE has adopted the WHO Healthy Workplaces model. And they will launch it across Ireland. And that's fantastic. So again, we're looking at case studies, at work on the ground to bring out to adapt even guidance for the particular sector, but other sectors as well. I have seen some really good work coming out. And it's encouraging now to see more and more focus, as I said, on the broader working conditions and trend towards creating healthy workplaces, not only focusing on health promotion and wellness, like a lot of organizations has been doing for many years, but more around the healthy psychosocial work environment.
Absolutely, yeah. You're spot on though. Like there's very well-intentioned organizations out there and individuals, and they want to do the right thing, and maybe they're listening to podcasts like this, and they have an idea of what they want to do. But it's that link. They're missing kind of the support tools, isn't it, to get from the intention to the actual implementation.
That's right. And I think that is a big need out there. There are some countries that have gone beyond, like this Management Standards for Work-Related Stress tool was adopted in Italy also. In 2008, there was a change in Italian law following the European Social Partner Agreement on Work-Related Stress. So they introduced specific law that includes very clear terminology of what organizations need to do around this area. And they adapted their tools, and now they have more focus on the smaller businesses, but also more focus on the intervention. So how do you follow up your results, and what are some good practice interventions that you can put in place? So some countries have already started doing some work in this area, but I think there is more work to be done. In the Netherlands also, there is a tool that allows you, they have collected sectoral examples. So depending on which sector you're in, if you put your results of the assessment, they direct you to specific interventions. So I think we need to see more work in more countries in this area.
Very good. It sounds like if there was a way kind of to pull all these different tools
and this is what exactly, and this is what we had suggested to the European Union, and I'm a little bit disappointed. You probably can tell I'm frustrated with this, but we will keep pushing to try and bring it all together. Please
do keep pushing. We'll keep pushing here on the podcast as well.
Sure.
You had it. I just saw on your profile. It was very interesting kind of dissertation. You were president of the jury for related to just investigating mental health first aid.
Yes,
I'm a big fan of mental health first aid. I think it's a wonderful program. I'd love to see more organizations adopt it. I guess a challenge I see or I hear from organizations is that they might have an EAP program, and then they might have mental health first aiders. And there's just this kind of attitude of the leadership team that this is great. Now we're done with mental health. We've ticked all the boxes.
Yes, and you're right. A lot of these approaches are more about identifying symptoms of people struggling, raising awareness, which is great.
Yeah.
Developing competence in how to identify them, very useful as well, but not actually necessarily dealing with the problems at source, coming back to the individual and how we support the individual. So the different levels of interventions that you will see also in the standard are about primary prevention, which is about dealing with the issue at source, secondary prevention, which is about competency development, and tertiary, which is about return to work and rehabilitations. And all of them are necessary in various ways. However, we need to prioritize the primary level and dealing with issue at source. So I would say for mental health first aid, in fact, the dissertation showed the same thing, that it was very useful for certain areas like awareness development and some skills development, but where employees are, of course, coming back to a work environment that is not healthy and they're experiencing the same problems, this unfortunately is not going to have the appropriate, the results that everybody wants to. The other issue with mental health first aid is that sometimes there is some stalling because people are training others. So train the trainers and the trainers train others, and there's knock-on effect. Sometimes in the process, this might stall a little bit, depending on the willingness of people to be involved. And I know in the University of Nottingham, we introduced it also there and rolled it out. And again, we had the same problem there, that after a little bit of time, there was some attrition in the number of trainers. So that is something also that was found through that research project.
Very good. Yeah, I've kind of got that feedback as well, that, the companies go through the training, there's that initial interest and positivity. Then I guess there's no structure or framework for building on that, or maybe even continuing the program and building it out. So that can be another challenge.
That's right. Yes. And it is the sustainability of many of these issues or programs, that, and we know that things are happening very fast. We saw also with the pandemic. Things change so fast, people move, and sometimes what you see is that when key individuals move in the organization, that knowledge is lost.
Yeah,
experience is lost, and then the sustainability of various initiatives just fades away. And so that's why we need to introduce these systems at the organizational level. And where possible, I guess that is more relevant to larger organizations, to introduce even key performance indicators in these areas. We did another one of my PhD students actually was working in Norway in the oil and gas industry. We published a lot on this case study, and they developed a tool that was on the basis of data that they had collected for many years. And this tool was used and linked to a key performance indicator for leaders. And so whenever the tool was coming out red, it had the usual red, orange, and green result. It was coming out red or even orange. They had to follow up, and the key performance indicator was there for the leaders. And that was quite powerful, of course. The change culture of the organization, and they prioritized these issues much more.
Excellent. Yeah, because I've actually mentioned that to a couple of companies here. There are one or two companies in Ireland have started very slowly introducing that. Yeah. I think it's for line managers initially, the KPIs. Right. Well, was that the case in your study? It was just for leaders?
It was, yes, it was for line managers, for leaders, but then they have to follow up the results and they have to do a more in-depth assessment, because I think their tool had only, if I remember, 11 or 12 questions. So it didn't give them the depth that they liked. So then if you got a result like an orange or of course a red, you had to follow up with a more in-depth assessment, and then you had to implement appropriate actions to deal with the issues that were identified.
Very good, very good. And how, in your opinion, how would that work if a company is interested in introducing something like that? Or maybe it's too early to say, but would it be something like 10% or a small percentage of a line manager's end of year targets it has a well-being focus, or how would that work?
Well, I mean, I don't, to be honest, I don't know the details, but I can correct you if you like, and you can find out more how they did it. Because I was involved in the development of the tool, the validation of the tool. Sure. The tool has very few questions, but they're weighted on the basis of the impact they have on well-being and other outcomes. Yeah. So immediately it gives them an indication, but then they input it in the system that we're using for key performance indicators. And were they using SAP, I think, to look at different types of indicators for leaders across the organization. And then, yes, in there, I'm not sure what the exact percentage was for the leaders.
Okay. If you like, something to keep an eye on. Yeah, that'd be great. Sure, yeah, fantastic. Sure. Again, one of the most popular questions we get is, again, the well-intentioned leaders, rolling out really interesting interventions or programs, but quite often it's the people in the organization that are already or they're already have an interest in that area, let's say, that engage with that intervention. I don't know if you've been involved in any projects or have any thoughts on how we encourage those perhaps that most need the intervention to actually get involved. Yeah, that is a very valid point. And of course, there's a lot of literature that has shown this. It's very hard sometimes it's hard to reach the people who need the intervention the most. That usually is because they have developed a certain level of cynicism or even their burnout because of their experience in the organization, or they're simply fatigued in relation to different organizational initiatives. So there are new things happening all the time, but in fact, they don't see them being followed through to the end where they need to. And so people might not see any point. And I think this is where you need to do your groundwork really well and to involve people from the beginning. And I think involving also key figures in the workforce, it shouldn't only come from the top. It needs to be organic, the process, and involving key figures in the workshop that can help motivate others to be involved, and keeping them involved throughout the process is very important. I think for me, whenever I go into organizations to do a risk assessment, I always make them promise that they will follow up, because I've been in many cases in organizations that find out about the issues, but then they don't want to touch them, back off. And that is hugely destructive, I would say. Absolutely, because the workforce has, you raise their expectations, they have hopes that you will deal with the issues, and then you just do nothing. I've heard that all too often, because there's some negative outcomes. They don't want to be transparent about it, and they kind of just sweep it under the carpet. So it makes it even worse. And the other thing that the mistake they make also is that they often decide on the appropriate actions only at the leader level. And again, that is not appropriate. You need to bring the results back to the workforce, and there needs to be at least some kind of consultation with your workforce in relation to what will work well. You can explain, of course, that maybe there is not, you will focus on certain key areas first, that maybe certain areas that come about
sometimes people cannot do anything about because of the changing nature of work or the work environment or the economic environment. But there needs to be some communication, consultation with the workers. And I think this is how you get people more, that you build trust. And this is how you get people more involved.
Great to hear you say all that. I mean, that's just echoing everything we try and say here on the show. It's just yes, absolutely, leadership, buy-in and alignment and support and advocacy, but also you need that kind of that shared ownership for well-being across the organization, so that it's not just seen as an initiative that's, you know, HR initiative or just a leadership initiative designed to generate more productivity or something like that.
Exactly. And, you know, often I'm asked, you know, is it better to go for it and do this ourselves within the organization, or is it better to have an external consultant? And the honest answer to this is it depends. It depends on the context in the organization. Sometimes you have contexts whereby people are ready to be open, and sometimes there is no trust, absolutely no trust. So it's better to bring somebody externally. Yeah. So again, it depends on the context. But as you will see in the standard, we also cover all these issues, whatever you mentioned, like ownership, but also worker participation is very important, and having a voice. And I think what we saw here now with the COVID-19 pandemic and a lot of people working from a distance, we saw that sometimes that voice was lost and people felt very isolated. And I think there is now, with a culture shift, it's not necessarily going to be complete going back to work, to the premises. It might be a hybrid work. Again, there are concerns there that people might sometimes lose their voice. And so we have to rethink how going forward, and if we look at how technology is used, can we use these new forms of technology to raise the voice of the employees? If you're interested, I published, I think in December it was, for the European Agency for Safety and Health at Work, a discussion paper around the future of working virtually and what are the implications for health, safety and well-being. And so there we address all these issues because, you know, there is there are trends out there that have been accelerated. You have the gig economy workers, maybe that not covered sufficiently in different frameworks, legislation frameworks. We have no collective agreements or bargaining, or a voice at least from employees. And there are also a more diverse workforce that we have to look at, and what are the needs and possibilities going forward. So there are a lot of things now that I think the landscape is very complex, and we need to, at different levels, be very proactive and agile to find solutions. Because developments are running very fast.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, we will, please do send on the link to that, or I'll find it, because we can share that with the audience. That you're reading my mind there. That was like almost my last question for you, because you've been so generous with your time. It was going to be around, like, what are your own thoughts on the future of work? What will that look like? And then of course, psychological health in the workplace, the future of that.
Yes. Yes, you're quite right, Brian, about that. And I think whatever review you read or any paper that comes out on the future of work, you will see the number one priority in there, not surprisingly, is the psychosocial work environment and mental health at work, in all of them, with no exception. And so, yes, we have this very difficult pandemic to deal with. On the other hand, it has raised awareness around these issues, more awareness than was there before. So, depending, of course, on where you are and you find yourself around the world, the priorities will still differ. And even within the European Union, if you look, you will see in that discussion paper that I referred to, you'll see that there is already a huge divide. In fact, before the pandemic, those of us who were capable, they had the skills and the knowledge to work, let's say, virtually or online, and this is where a lot of the sectors are moving now. In certain countries, they were as low as 3%, and that is the EU I'm talking about. In other countries, they were about 40%. Okay, but on average, it was only about 14% of us working in this way before the pandemic.
Yeah.
After the pandemic, we are at about 40 to 50, but again, it varies. And again, there was a lot of literature to show that only that 1/3 of the EU workforce has no digital skills at all.
1/3.
1/3, and that was shocking.
Yeah.
Shocking. And you will see that there are some countries that train their employees more than others, of course, and that depends on whether they are more active, these countries, in the knowledge-intensive sectors. They bring out new technology, for example. But the picture is not uniform, even across the EU. Imagine now on a global basis. So we will see, unfortunately, that unless governments invest in the development of more digital skills and supporting businesses in this development as well, that divide that already existed will get wider in certain cases. So we need to alleviate that, because that implies that there will be even bigger inequalities when it comes to the world of work. And then mental health issues will become even more prevalent, we expect, unfortunately. And so we need to rethink our systems and processes to make them more agile at various levels. So for the future, policymaking, unfortunately, policymakers are always running after the developments because they're happening very fast. So can we have systems that, as I said before, are based on forecasting of problems, not always reacting, and that's difficult, and sometimes there's no political will. We have seen it also in countries around the world. Then it is about making sure that the workforce is retrained, and reskilling will happen faster and faster in the future, and it's necessary. And of course, how do we ensure that working with new technologies, machines, algorithms that are used more and more in the world of work, what are the challenges that arise out of these interactions? We need to invest in more research in these areas to be able to support businesses and the workforce going forward. Okay,
so plenty of challenges, but thankfully we have fantastic policymakers and professors out there to support us in this, and so hopefully something like ISO 45003 will be a real help to a lot of organizations, I'm sure.
That's right, and as I said, we do update the standards, so as more evidence will come out, we will make sure that this new knowledge is incorporated in the guidance that is included there.
Excellent. Stavroula, I've really enjoyed this. Thanks so much for sharing all this today. Where's the best place for people to go to find out more about you and your work?
So you can look at if you just Google myself, Stavroula Leka UCC, you find a lot of information there on me, and or you can email me. Very happy to share my email, Brian, and then people can get in touch as necessary.
Thanks so much, Stavroula. And I will share links to some of the articles that we referenced today as well in the show notes. Stavroula, thank you. You
can also find me on LinkedIn, of course. As well.
Of course.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. I really enjoyed it too.
A real pleasure. Thank you, Stavroula.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for this week. Go to workwellpodcast.com if you'd like to access the show notes for this episode. Quick favor to ask. Can you head over to iTunes or Google Play or wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate, and leave a review for the Workwell podcast? It would be a huge help. So thank you. If you want to dive deeper in the area of workplace health promotion, if you want to educate yourself in this area, then make sure to check out the Workwell Institute. It's our online learning hub. It's a one-stop shop for all your workplace well-being training needs. You'll find all the details at workwellinstitute.org. By the way, the original music that you're hearing right now was composed by my good friend, Greg Clifford. Check him out at gregcliffordmusic.com. Thanks for listening right to the end. Remember to work well, stay safe, and I'll see you on the next episode.